Éric Verhaeghe.
Good morning, and at first, thank you to you, Jacques, for your speech and for your invitation. I'm very happy to be with you this morning, and I think that we are delayed, so I will be very short on my presentation. I just want to speak this morning about, I'm going to take the microphone. I'm going to speak this morning about France's banking system and financial crisis as an example of the need for a Glass-Steagall Act in France. At first, I want to make a point, a general point about my presentation, and to precise that I don't want this morning to do an economic analysis. I want to do a political analysis, because I think that the Glass-Steagall Act and the Glass-Steagall Act issue, for example in France, but even in the world, is a political problem and a matter of political choice, not a problem of economic system or of economic process. So I will present not an economical analysis, neither an historical analysis, but an attempt to understand the Glass-Steagall problem and the banking system problem today in France like in the world by the way of political analysis. It's very small on the board, but I want just to show 2 points this morning. You see there a board explaining the world ranking of banks. And usually when we read in the newspaper a ranking of the world banks, we have a ranking by market capitalization, the amount of the stocks in the world. And you see on the red lines, I put a red color on the Chinese banks. You see in the 10 greater banks in the world, we have 4 Chinese banks, and we have in green 4 United States banks. So in the 10 biggest banks by market capitalization in the world, we have 4 Chinese banks and we have 4 American banks. So usually we consider that the banking world system is owned by America and China. And we have this feeling that the most powerful banking system in the world are American system and China's system. China's banking system is new, it's innovation, because China wants to have also a powerful banking system. But if we change the technique of ranking, and if we leave the ranking by capitalization, by market capitalization, and if we take the ranking by assets, it's the economic properties of the banks, we see that China's banks are less powerful. And we see that the first American bank by assets in the world is the 6th bank. It's the Bank of America. And the most powerful banks by assets are the line in blue, the BNP, Banque Nationale de Paris. The second one is BNP as an asset is a French bank, you have understood. And the assets detained by BNP is equal to 3,000 billion of dollars. After you have the Royal Bank of Scotland, United Kingdom, almost 3,000 billion of dollars of assets. The third bank in the world is the HSBC Holdings, United Kingdom. And the fourth bank in the world is Crédit Agricole, France. The fifth bank, Barclays Banks, United Kingdom. You see on the 21st banks in the world, we have 4 British banks, 4 French banks. What I want to show with this board is that we have the illusion that today financial system is held by China and United States, but indeed European banks, French banks, and United Kingdom banks are most powerful in the world. And the reality of financial system today is that it is held by European banks and European finance. A survey of those figures. Today, the total French banks' assets is about 8 trillion, 8,000 billion of dollars. British banks' assets, about 9,000 billion dollars. And total of US banks' assets, about $6 trillion. So we see that France and United Kingdom have developed a very powerful financial industry. And this world-side financial industry, which exists like a true political power, exists since the 80s. And today, we don't have really an international competition between the European financial system, which is very powerful, and the other system, because European finance has an amount of assets which is very, very, very important. On this board, I try a comparison of our too big to fail and the size of the assets of the countries. We see that, for example, the BNP Paribas balance sheet is equal to $3,000 billion, and the French gross domestic product is equal to $2,600 billion of dollars. So, for example, the size of the balance sheet of the BNP in France is bigger than the size of the asset of the France balance sheet, if you want, of the French domestic product. It's the same thing. I just take a figure to summarize. The UK plus the France total amounts of banking assets is superior to the US gross domestic product. In other words, the size of the French and British banks are more important today than the annual wealth produced in the United States. And you cannot understand today the power of the financial industry if you don't remember the importance of the balance sheet of the banks. Today, the balance sheets of the banks are more important than the national production every year in each world country, even in the United States. So, this short survey raises a few questions. And I want just deal this morning with 2 questions. It's a very long problem, but I have to be concise. At first, it's important to understand by which historical process French and United Kingdom countries have developed this financial industry, which is a world-size industry without true competition today. And the second question is important to understand what is the role of the financial elite, the financial oligarchy, the financial power in each country. What is their role in this revolution, in the birth of the financial power? So, today I won't have the time to deal with the important problem of the banking system and the public debt, because if we had the time, we could see that public debt today is a result, a consequence, a natural consequence of the development of the financial world industry. And we won't deal with the issue of the link between investment, public investment and banking system. We will just have a focus on the historical process of building of the financial power and historical explanation of the role of the elite. In France, the history of the financial industry is organized around 3 moments. At first, just after the Second World War, we knew a period of superiority of states. Every bank in France was nationalized and was a property of the French state. In 1966, French government decided to proceed to a relative deregulation. And it's in 1984 that the French government, Mitterrand system at this time, decided to give birth to a true industry, repealing all the nationalization acts and proceeding to a total deregulation of the French banking system. Nationalization Act in 1945. Why? 2 main reasons. At first, France had the idea that the French bankers had a behavior of collaboration with the German occupant at this time, and decided to punish the bankers by nationalizing the banks. Second reason, and the true reason, was that the banking system was totally ruined, at first by the crisis before the war, and secondly by the war itself. And the banks, French banks, were unable to proceed to the reconstruction effort necessary after the war. So in 1945, the government, with General de Gaulle, decided to pass an act about a separation of bank types according to their business. It's the Glass-Steagall French Act in 1945. And it was a good act because this system allowed a true reconstruction and an efficient reconstruction, totally operated and managed by the French state. At this time, the people who decided the reconstruction, the people who decided the public effort and the public investment were not the bankers. It was a department of the finance ministry, which was the treasury. You know, Jack, what is the treasury? It's a very important department. It was a very important department in the financial ministry. And it was there that everything was decided in the financing of France at this time. And it was efficacious, very efficient. In 1966, there was a first deregulation, and there was an act in France who allowed to the banks to develop their activities, and it was a first softening of the separation between the types of activities of the banks. And at first, at this time, the law, the act, permit a new development of private bank system in France. And in 1944, the government passed an act. It was the minister at this time was Pierre Verhaeghe, which is well known in France because he commits suicide 10 years ago, and it was a mystery. Pierre Verhaeghe decided to repeal the Separation Act of investment bank and credit bank, and he decided to repeal our Glass-Steagall Act and to proceed to a total deregulation of the French banking system. it was the project of very big financial company, and French government had the idea at this time to create a very, very, very world-size financial bank and insurance company to have a huge competitor on the world market. It was a public ambition, the French public ambition of a French industrial world-size, a French financial world-size industry. At this time, French government, after the 1944 Act, French government decided to privatize financial system, and to privatize our public banks. You have the list of few privatization. For example, Société Générale in 1946, Banque Nationale de Paris in 1993. It was a period of 10 years of privatization of public bank. And it is at this time that in France we develop a private banking system. Remember that 20 years ago, French banks were public, were state bank. And we decided to give to the private sector those banks and to constitute a world-size industry with those public banks privatized. How this is possible? What's the role of the elite in this constitution? I call that the birth of a financial power, because all those public decisions, all those political decisions has been taken by a French aristocracy. You know that in France we have a tradition of, we call that the dress nobility. It's a nobility which is constituted by public servants. And this is tradition of public servants, like noble people, who decided to privatize the banking, the French banking system, and to organize a private industry of a world size. There is a concentration of French nobility, of republic aristocracy, in the General Finance Inspection. It's a department of the finance ministry, the FGI. And this FGI is a concentration of public servants who manage the political economy and the economical policy, and who manage today the private banking system. I took two examples of those general inspectors, of those public servants who decided to privatize the public bank in France and to constitute, to build a French financial world-size industry. For example, Jean-Yves Arber, he was born in 1932. He's a former of the École Nationale d'Administration. He was finance general inspector, and in 1966, he was the finance minister advisor who decided the act of 1966, the first Deregulation Act in France. He was the advisor who conceived this act, who wrote it, and who managed it. He was Treasury Director in 1978, and he was involved in the monetary European system. And in 1982, he was the chairman of the BNP. And you see the bridge between the public servant who decide the French policy about bank system, and this bridge between the public service and the private bank, where they become chairman and where they decide to operate the bank, the financial system in France after having decided the constitution. Jean-Yves Arber is well known in France because he was the chairman of the Crédit Lyonnais at the period of the collapse of the Crédit Lyonnais, and the collapse of the Crédit Lyonnais, the failure, cost 15 billion euros to the French citizen. Another example of this French aristocracy who decided to constitute, to build the French banking private system is Michel Pedro. He was born in 1942, École nationale d'administration, finance general inspector, finance minister advisor in 1970, and today chairman of the Banque nationale de Paris. Those two examples, I like Michel Pedro and I like Jean-Yves Arber. But those two examples, both examples, shows by which way the financial aristocracy is born from a state aristocracy. And it's the same aristocracy who decided to privatize public bank and who manage today the privatized bank which was public. And the same people pass the act and benefit of the act. I think it's very important to have this idea because we often have the illusion that the too big to fail, that the international bank system, that the international financial system is a sort of natural creation, a sort of unescapable product of the human society. In reality, this system is a result, a consequence of political choices managed by people who decided to use the general interest and the general policy to have personal benefits and to defend their conception of the economy and their conception of the society. So in conclusion, for my very short intervention, I want to say that today we have in France a system of too big to fail banks, which is a world-size system, more powerful than the American banking system. Like the British system. This French banking system was decided 30 years ago. At first, this system was a public system, a state system, and it became a private system by the decision of a political choice, which is an elite, an oligarchical choice. And today, we must remember that the financial crisis, at first, is the crisis of this system of privatization of public interest, and it's a crisis of this choice imposed by a minority who benefit of this system during 30 years. Okay, it's finished. I want to present you because I think that France is an interesting example today of the financial development, and I think France will be an interesting area to test, to improve the Glass-Steagall Act of the modern times.